Hi, I'm JB Poisson. So a couple of months ago, the hugely popular streamer Aiden Ross got Donald Trump a Tesla Cybertruck.
Check out this rapper. Let me know your honest thoughts.
I think it's incredible.
The truck was wrapped with a photo of Trump, the one with his fist raised in the air after the failed assassination attempt back in July. Trump went on to do an 80-minute interview with Ross on his stream. The appearance is just one of many efforts to aggressively court what some have called the bro or the frat vote in the upcoming U.S. election. Read young men under 30. Here is Trump introducing the Canadian-American streamers, the Nelk Boys, at one of his campaign rallies.
The Nelk Boys, where are you guys? Where are you? You here someplace? Thank you, fellas. You want to come up? If you want, come up.
And here is Trump walking into a UFC fight in New Jersey back in June.
45, being ushered in by UFC CEO Dana White. Donald Trump is in the building, and the former president getting a standing ovation from the assembled masses.
If you don't know who any of these guys are, don't worry, we're going to get to that. But the reason that we're talking about them is because polls show that an enormous gulf has opened up between young men and women in this election. Gen Z men are way more likely to support Trump. Some think that this could swing the election. Obviously, the Democrats are worried about this. Last week, Kamala Harris's team said they were in talks for her to go on the Joe Rogan podcast. Today, my guest is Sam Wolfson. He wrote this great piece for The Guardian looking at why and how many young men have shifted to Trump and globally to the right in recent years. Sam, hi, welcome to Front Burner.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
All right, so this is a big gap here. According to recent New York Times Siena polls, Trump leads Harris among young men, 58 to 37%, and Harris leads young women, 67 to 28. The numbers for the men might not seem intuitive to a lot of people because young people have historically voted for more politically progressive parties, but this is one of the biggest political gender gaps in decades. And when do you think we started to see this split really emerge in the United States?
Yeah, I think that's right. We've kind of assumed over the last few election cycles that the young are a group that the Democrats can rely on. And certainly, in the 2016 election, the 2020 election, the midterms, we've always seen that voters under 30 have overwhelmingly voted for the Democrats. This shift, I think, has happened in around the last 6 years, and it's been very stark and very sudden. This divide has opened up between young men and young women. And one of the most noticeable things about it is that it has been rapid, and it has happened in not just in the US, but around the world. You see kind of a similar trend where young men have making a small shift rightwards and young women have made a huge shift leftwards. So you get this divergence because young women are probably the most progressive generation in history. The numbers are in the 80s in terms of their support for the Democrats and left-wing positions. And young men, I wouldn't say so much, that it's like they've made a hard turn to Trump, but they're certainly shrugging their shoulders at what traditional politics and kind of center-left politics can offer them and are exploring other options.
I think that's a really good point. I just want to put a line under the gap is going in both directions, right? It's also because the women are moving further left. Is this all young men, the slight shift that we're seeing to the right? Even young Hispanic and Black men, are we seeing them shift rightwards as well?
I mean, I think it's a complicated question because one of the reasons that maybe this trend has only been noticed in the wake of the upcoming election is because this isn't a question that pollsters would necessarily ask, or they would ask about how young people were voting, but they weren't dividing it by gender, and then they weren't subdividing gender by race and other factors. So a lot of this information that we're getting is kind of mixed and new. But from what you can see in most polls, there is a shift across almost every demographic of young male voters. So among, for example, young male Black voters, there is still they're mostly Democratic voters, but they're still slightly shifting towards the Republicans. It's certainly not true that if you're a Black young man, you're still much more likely to be a Democrat than a Republican in the US. But the trend lines, as it were, are kind of the same across most demographics. I think with the exception of LGBT young men who have kind of remained where they are, which is overwhelmingly Democratic.
Right, right. On the issue of young Black men, you can tell certainly this is a group that the Democrats seem quite worried about right now. I think former President Obama was just out on the campaign trail trying to speak to this group.
On the other side, you have someone who has consistently shown disregard, not just for the communities, but for you as a person. And you're thinking about sitting out?
I want to get into with you more in a bit the underlying structural reasons that seem to have given Trump and the Republicans an opening here. Like, why these men are moving more to the right. But first, talk to me a bit about the myriad ways that the Republican Party has been trying to grab these guys. What has the message been? What kind of talking points have we been hearing?
They've kind of got a range of different strategies. They're obviously targeting this group. They see them as a group that not only are they kind of people who might not have voted otherwise, so they're like an untapped group of voters, but they're also a group of people who are likely to shift from the Democrats to the Republicans. So to their minds, they need to go after them hard. One of the ways they're doing that is to turn the Republican Party into this testosterone-fueled, hyper-masculine party. I mean, to watch the Republican National Convention this year, you could have been watching WWE, Trump came out to Kid Rock.
Say fight, fight! Say Trump, Trump!
There was Dana White, the head of the UFC there, introducing him.
My fellow Americans, it is my honor to introduce the 45th and soon-to-be 47th President of the United States, Donald J. Trump.
Trump has been going to loads of UFC Ultimate Fighting Championship fights.
Boy, the round of applause he's getting right now is pretty staggering. And you had to imagine that's what was going to happen.
And also, Trump has been kind of courting these right-wing young male YouTubers who are kind of not really in the political space. They're more like pranksters. They more say silly things. There's these, you mentioned the Nelk boys, there's Aiden Ross, there's Dave Portnoy and his Barstool Sports Media Network. And Trump and the Republicans have found that by going into these kinds of non-political spaces, they do two things. They reach young men where they are, which is important. Bigger than that, they have a response to the Democrats' charge that this is a really, really important election. The most important election of our lifetime. Democracy is on the line. And instead of replying to that or disagreeing with it, what the Republicans are saying is, hey, let's have a good time. Let's chill out. Let's go in a Elon Musk supercar. Let's have a beer. Let's have Elon Musk giving away $1 million to voters.
Every day from now until the election, we're giving out $1 million prize. That is, and all you have to do is sign a petition in support of the Constitution. It's very straightforward. You don't even have to vote. You're most welcome.
They're making it feel fun. And I think that, again, by sort of lowering the stakes of the election, making it seem silly and memey, that's another way of reaching these boys.
When Trump goes on some of these shows, right? So he's been on Aiden Ross, as we talked about, Jake and Logan Paul. Those are two brothers kind of deeply steeped in the fighting world. Theo Vaughn. Does he talk about anything serious? Anything real? How would you describe the conversations beyond the kind of having a good time vibe?
I mean, he talks about UFOs. On every single one, he talks about UFOs. I'm just saying, like, it starts with that.
I've met with pilots, like beautiful Tom Cruise, but taller.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Handsome, perfect people. Sir, there was something there that was round in form and going like 4 times faster than my super jet fighter plane. And I look at these guys, and they really mean it.
Yeah.
And
you have to understand, like, the place it begins is, wow, this is going to get loads of listeners. I'm going to make you so popular. He talks a lot about his son, Barron. He always mentions that Barron is a huge fan. And I do think that Barron Trump, who is Trump's youngest son, who's just started at NYU, is somewhat leading this strategy and telling him which of these podcasts to go on.
My son's a big fan of yours, Barron.
Really? Barron is?
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
he just graduated high school, right?
That's right. He just did. He knows you very well. He said, Dad, he's big.
Wow.
Yeah, big one.
That's cool.
But then he does pivot and he does start to talk about his talking points. He talks about the border. He talks about how evil Kamala is. And also these podcasters then take up some of those positions themselves. So the Nelk boys, on an episode of their thing that Trump wasn't on, I think when Kamala was giving her speech to the DNC, they like smashed the television that she was on.
Kamala Harris will never be my president.
This is not high-level politicking, right? This is happening at quite a base level. But I think Trump is a kind of master manipulator, and he has fun with these guys, but he does slip in a lot of his politics, and that is the politics that they share. These guys are very right-wing. Some of them are more mainstream, like Jake and Logan Paul are obviously hugely popular. They're kind of very apolitical. They're boxers, and they just want to have a good time. And I think by creating this kind of weird mishmash of politics, racism, fighting, gambling, like all these different things, it makes it like hard to tell exactly what's going on. Yeah. And yet you leave with this strong Republican message.
Yeah, I mean, Theo Vaughn too is quite apolitical. He's had Bernie Sanders on.
Totally.
Like, I have to say, there's a whole section of that interview that Trump did with Theo Vaughn where Trump actually seemed super into the conversation, and they were talking about drug addiction and alcohol addiction.
So you're way up with cocaine more than anything else you can think of.
Cocaine will turn you into a damn owl, homie. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. You'll be out on your own porch, and you'll be your own street lamp. You're freaking.
And is that a good feeling? Well,
no,
it's
horrible.
A miserable feeling.
But you do it anyway, just like the guy you're saying with the scotch.
I just want to talk about the Nelk boys specifically because they're really interesting to me because they're actually helping to get out the vote, right? In a very real way. And can you just tell me more about that?
Yeah, when they were interviewing J.D. Vance, they announced that they're doing a $20 million registration drive to get more young men to vote.
And you guys have a voice, believe it or not. I know you're one person, but you got to encourage everybody around you. That's why we're doing this. Sendthevote.com. Let's do this, boys. This is our last chance.
And so, yeah, they are turning some of this excitement of having these big Republican figures on the podcast into very specific kind of actions into getting their listeners to vote. But they're not the only ones. Like, something that I think goes in hand with these more fun media appearances is that the machine of the Republican Party is wildly spending on getting these voters out to vote. In fact, by some reckoning, in terms of like targeted ad spend, they're outspending the Democrats 10-1 in Pennsylvania. And wow. I mean, one of the ads that they're running really heavily there, I was just going to read a tiny bit of it because it just speaks to what this messaging is. It goes, "We did everything we were supposed to.
Graduated high school, got jobs, put in the work to get ahead. And at every turn, Democrats said we were the problem. So they set quotas at schools to exclude us, rigged corporate America against us, and turned the other way when their economy left us behind. Even if we do everything right, Harris and the Democrats find new ways to make us pay. For what? No matter what we do, Democrats are against us. So this November,
we're against them.
Wow.
And I think that is like a very powerful encapsulation of how this kind of silly politicking and going on these YouTubes is turned into this very potent message of resentment, right? And we saw Trump stoke up white resentment in the 2016 election, and now he's trying to do the same thing here with male resentment and male resentment specifically towards women, you know, and towards the Democrats. And so the Nelk boys sit at this kind of node between those two messages, I think.
Talk to me a little bit more about the resentment that the Republicans are tapping into there, right? Like, what is that argument that these guys, these young guys, have been left behind? Is that their situation materially?
Well, I think that there's like kind of two schools of thought on this issue. I mean, like I said, this kind of big gap that emerged between men and young men and young women started about sort of 6 to 8 years ago, which is around the similar time that Me Too was happening, that, you know, there was a kind of sense of feminism reaching a new place in the public discourse. And I think that at that time, Trump began seeding the ideas of this politics of resentment. It happened when he was in the confirmation process for Brett Kavanaugh for the Supreme Court, and there were these claims made against Kavanaugh that he had sexually assaulted young women.
Kavanaugh's accuser is Christine Ford. She says that when she was a high school student, maybe 15 years old, a drunken Kavanaugh, a couple of years older, attacked her in a bedroom at a party.
Former Yale classmate told senators and the FBI last year that he saw Mr. Kavanaugh with his pants down at a drunken dorm party where friends pushed his genitals onto a female student. The shocking story, strikingly similar to an allegation made by another Yale classmate, Deborah Ramirez.
And Trump said, you know, it's a dangerous time to be a man in America.
Well, I say that it's a very scary time for young men in America when you can be guilty of something that you may not be guilty of.
And I think that was the beginning of him suggesting that, like, you know, he would always say, you can't do anything as a man. And that message has been kind of refracted around the manosphere.
Yeah.
You know, there's this huge guy, we talked about Aidan Ross and Logan Paul, but another big figure in all of this is Andrew Tate.
Andrew Tate, known as the king of toxic masculinity.
I will state right now that I am absolutely sexist and I'm absolutely a misogynist.
The former kickboxer turned male influencer has built up a huge following online, mostly among young men. But in real life, Tate is now facing 3 legal cases in 2 countries, all on allegations of abusing women.
The charges include rape, human trafficking and forming an organised crime group, as well as illegally accessing a...
He very much stokes this idea that men are in a worse position because of feminism and that they are being held back by women.
Let me tell you all the reality of female privilege. Because we're living in the time of female privilege, not male privilege. Because a lot is expected of men, and we're expected to perform. And if we do not perform, the world has no mercy. Women have no mercy on us when we fail to perform, and other men have
I think that both Trump and the ecosystem around him have spent the best part of a decade creating this narrative that men are doing worse off,
right?
You know, and that it's the fault of women. And I think that's now the kind of fertile ground which they're sowing.
This idea that men are doing worse off than women, like from an economic perspective, is there merit to that?
Yeah, there is merit to it, and it is true. Like, if you look at young men and young women in a lot of cities in America, men are having worse economic outcomes. They're finding it harder to get a job. The jobs that they are getting are worse paid. Men are enrolling at universities at a lower rate. So there has been a shift. It's been a shift that's taken about 25 years to take place. And it's certainly not true at every age group, right? In older age groups, men are still being paid more than women, particularly after women might leave the workforce for a while to have children and come back. All of those existing structures, the gender pay gap, still exist. But for this group of under 30s, it's the other way around. Like, women are being paid, are doing better at college. And I think there is a absolute economic truth to this resentment. But that doesn't mean that men are being discriminated against. In fact, there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that they are. The question of why that is a very complicated one, but it isn't one of discrimination. The Republicans have entered this narrative to a set of statistics. There is an economic truth to this, and that is something that could really be dealt with by politicians. And in fact, the Democrats are quite afraid to talk about the economic truth of this because they have always been the party of women. And so even when they do fantastic policies that really do help young men, they don't want to say so. They don't want to say, hey, this is going to be fantastic for young men in America.
Right.
Whereas the Republicans aren't doing anything anyway, really, because at this point, they're mostly a party of just anti-immigration and vibes. But they're only too happy to kind of use the rhetoric of trying to help these boys who have been left behind by society.
Right. And I mean, in some ways, that makes perfect sense to me as a woman, why the Democrats would want to avoid that, because I do have to check myself in this conversation here a bit. I think I hear, you talking about men feeling like they have it unfair and like the world has kind of been working against them. And I have this real urge to just completely roll my eyes, right? But I do wonder, have the Democrats left these guys behind? And are they going to regret that in the coming weeks and months?
I mean, let's take one of the most stark areas, right? Suicide is one of the clearest areas in which there's a huge gender divide. The Democrats have lots of task forces on women and girls' health, as they should. But a lot of people, for example, Richard Reeves, who has founded this think tank for men and boys and is working a lot in this space, is saying, why don't they have a task force on male suicide when there are 40,000 deaths a year? So that's just one area in which it would be possible, it would be politically advantageous to kind of speak directly to a group. But if you watch something like the Democratic National Convention, which, for my sins, I kind of did for 4 nights in a row, there is no mention of that. The message is, this is a party that is going to protect abortion. This is a party for women. And that might be a sound political strategy, but it also might not be.
Right. Because the other way to look at this question is not to ask the question, why are young men gravitating towards the right, but why have they been leaving the left? It's the other way to look at it. Harris's team is apparently in talks for her to go on Joe Rogan. And, again, with this kind of manosphere, there's a lot of overlap there. And what does that tell you at this point in the campaign that they're trying to do that?
Well, there was this really interesting bit of polling that the New York Times did a couple of months ago. And they were trying to isolate factors of what were the kind of key factors that would make someone leave the Democrats who had previously voted for them. And the number one factor was if they were born in the Middle East, which obviously has a lot to do with what's going on in Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
And the number two factor is whether they were a Joe Rogan listener.
Wow.
And I think that it's very, very impactful. And I think Joe Rogan, what's interesting about him is that he sort of swings around a lot. He has some very Trumpy views. He has some very traditional Democratic views. He's not the brightest cookie. I mean, he often doesn't completely understand, I think, what a lot of his guests are saying, but he does have this kind of sweet, empathetic, everyman appeal. And
curious.
Yeah.
Genuinely curious. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that it makes a lot of sense for Kamala to want to put her point across and be in that space and maybe be challenged by someone like him. So I can see how that is one smart move, but I think that the Democrats don't want to fall too much into the culture war game that the Republicans are trying to play. The Democrats are currently in the White House. And during that time, President Biden passed this infrastructure bill that was a fantastic bill for young men. It provided a huge amount of jobs for young men.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to say that. And they don't say that. They haven't said, like, this is a space in which we're really helping you. There's a fear of doing so. And I think it's the fear that you also speak to in having this conversation. It's like awkward, because as I said, like, young men are not being discriminated against. And yet there should be no problem for politicians to say we want to help women and men, to slightly tweak their message depending on who they're talking to. I think that's normal.
Sam, you are obviously British.
Yeah, I can't hide it. I thought I was hiding it so well.
And this is not just playing out in the U.S., right? What we've been talking about today. And so in Canada, I was looking at some data this morning from a firm called Abacus Data here that shows a big gender gap when it comes to attitude towards Trump from young men and women here. There's a huge gender gap. And then young men here are far more likely to have a positive impression of our conservative opposition leader, Pierre Poilievre. And what have you seen from the UK, from where you're from?
I think it's a similar picture. I mean, obviously, because of our very different political systems, it kind of manifests in different ways. But I think that in the UK, there's been these horrific scenes of far-right violence in a lot of northern towns and cities, kind of marauding groups burning down migrant accommodation. On mainland Europe, there's been something similar, and in mainland Europe, a lot of far-right parties have been elected to government and to the European Union Parliament. And looking at the footage of those supporters and looking at the footage of the people in the UK doing these racist attacks, they look like the kind of guys that I went to school with. They look like normal young boys. And I find that to be chilling. Clearly something has happened in the way that people get their information, in the way that these messages are spread, that has shifted the view of young boys and young men into a different kind of political reality. And it's really discomforting. And I think a lot about parents. The Guardian has done this long series on young men in the election. And one of the pieces we ran was about this father who felt he had lost his son to this world, And I think, this was a liberal, loving father who struggled with trying to show his son that the information he was getting online wasn't right, and that is a real challenge. We used to talk a lot about like losing your parents to Fox News.
Yep.
And I feel like now it's kind of switching, and some parents feel like they are losing their kids to this set of beliefs that are so antithetical to how they try to raise their children.
Yeah. I have two young boys, very young, but this has really consumed a lot of my thoughts lately. Sam, I want to thank you for this. This was great and so interesting. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, that is all for today. I'm JB Poisson. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.